In the modern consciousness, Italy is defined by its history. From the allusions to Italian heritage and age-old familial traditions, to the ancient Roman past and the architectural and artistic icons that symbolize its continued here-ness across the nation, to the international references to Italian blood and lineage that seem to couch an array of behavioral characteristics, like expressing oneself with their hands or having a keen perception to truly authentic Italian cooking. It seems outright foreign that only a century ago, Italian philosophers, literary figures, and cultural critics once lamented Italians were not conscious of their own historical roots. Indeed, as the 19th century came to a close and Italy faced some of its most dramatic social and economic problems, from mass immigration, widespread protests, revolt, corruption, poverty, there emerged a rising culture of Italian philosophers, sociologists, economists, and literary figures, all almost suddenly concerned with the nature and meaning of history. This movement, this larger culture of Italian historical thought, focused highly abstract questions of historical development and teleology, of historical being and knowledge, and of radical historicity and national consciousness. It was during this time when iconic Italian thinkers such as the legendary economist and sociologist Vilfredo Pareto, the great theorist of history Benedetto Croce, and even Mussolini's philosopher of fascism Giovanni Gentile, would collide over the logic of history, bringing together fragments of a broad range of international thought, from Darwinian and Spencerian evolutionism, Karl Marx's historical materialism, and the German idealism of George Hegel. To be sure, there was a linearity to these movements. By the end of the 19th century, Italians at large had been struck by Darwin's On the Origins of Species, challenging Catholic notions of divine, historical providence, and at the same time bringing Italian scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, economists, and even educators such as the well-known Maria Montessori to the thought of Herbert Spencer, an English theorist who famously extended evolution into the social realm and coined the phrase survival of the fittest. This moment was also at the origins of widespread socialist politics and Marxist thought in Italy, with novel organizations like the Italian Socialist Party springing up and even winning elections across the nation. These two sects of thought, evolutionism and Marxism, arose and proclaimed the scientific nature of their disciplines and especially rejected the metaphysical and mystical notions of religion and idealism. Almost suddenly, history was nothing more than the process of survival of the fittest in time, nothing more than the progressive accumulation of subsistence over millennia, and therefore had been disenchanted and secularized into a story where national identity and purpose no longer reflected the successive manifestation of the living Word of God, as Risorgimento Italians like Giuseppe Mazzini maintained only a few decades previously, but rather, according to the sociologist Enrico Ferri, history, now seemingly, led inevitably to the negation of God. However, largely in response to evolutionists and Marxists themselves, a burgeoning cohort of Italian Hegelians soon rejected these apparently inflexible and rigid formulas of history. In radical rejection of preset formulas or determinations of historical transformation and process, these young Hegelians began to champion notions of absolute historicity. That is, as Benedetto Croce would maintain, the belief that the only determinative specificity of life that there is, that there ever was or could be, is that everything is historical, in constant processual change, flux, and absolute contingency, and that therefore nothing could really ever be that did not have a historical reality. By the 1900s, these Italian Hegelians would go on to not only lambast ahistorical, positivist notions of science, nor simply reject the rigid conceptual models of inevitable Marxist-inspired dreams of capitalist breakdown and socialist revolution, but they would go on to form and articulate the absolutely historical, theoretical underpinnings of Italian national identity. This video traces this story from evolutionists, Marxists, and then to the Hegelian revival. Finally, it concludes by reference to the broader legacy of Italian historical theory for fascists. The story of Charles Darwin's investigations upon the HMS Beagle is legendary. It was there that he collected facts that cast light on the origin of species. Although Darwin's On the Origin of Species was devoted to non-human animals, in the conclusion of his book, he speculated on the light yet to shine on the origin of man and his history. Darwin clearly alluded to the extension of his evolutionary model to humans, a concept he would later explore in The Descent of Man. Indeed, although evolution today has triumphed as a secular and naturalistic explanation of biological life, the origins of the concept and the Victorian and colonial cultures around that origin were far more metaphysical, leaning on outright divine. The translation of Darwin's On the Origins of Species by Giovanni Canestrini and Leonardo Salimbeni interpreted it as theological, translating favored races to perfected races, and thereby concluding that natural selection tended all the qualities of body and spirit towards perfection. As the historian Andrew Robbins points out, this was likely an effort to negate the indifference of natural selection and therefore imbue historical development with purpose. Of course, Darwin was not the only source of evolutionary thought in Italy, and perhaps not even the most popular. As I have said, Herbert Spencer was an immediate hit. In the immediate decade after his first translation in 1867, there appeared a total of 12 translations and reprints of Spencer's vast and wordy corpus, followed by 23 in the subsequent decade, and a remarkable 27 the next. Indeed, I have already referenced the so-called Spencer effect that took Italy by storm following his initial translations. By the 1900s, even Canestrini himself had differentiated evolution from Darwinism proper. It did not take long for evolutionary concepts to ignite discussions over the nature of historical change in Italy. The first promoter of Marxist thought in Italy, the economist and sociologist Achille Loria, thought that social evolution is regulated by a law which asserts itself with inflexible logic. Although Loria subscribed to Marx's historical materialism, he integrated evolution extensively into his works, a maneuver unexpectedly common in Italy. Canestrini himself thought socialism could defend against conservative forces that threatened to, quote, regress the nation backward on the evolutionary track. One article even appeared in the famous socialist journal Critica Sociale, titled Carlo Marx Killed by Charles Darwin, according to the opinion of one of our Darwinists, in 1892, and received a response from Filippo Turati himself, the founder of the Italian Socialist Party. To be sure, many Italian Marxists readily embraced evolution for its secular, naturalistic viewpoint. Karl Marx had, in fact, applauded Darwin's natural scientific basis for his own theory of class struggle in history. Italian positivists widely accepted evolution for similar reasons. As we've seen, the positivist sociologist Enrico Ferri claimed in Socialismo e Scienza Positiva, leading even to the scathing response from Herbert Spencer himself, that Darwin and Spencer's theories led inevitably to the negation of God. Ferri had declared his entrance into the glorious positivist army decades prior, and in Socialismo e Scienza Positiva, he outright claimed that the supreme law of nature of social Darwinism led to the natural and inevitable socialist revolution. According to Ferri, scientific socialism even predicted that historical development with mathematical certainty. While positivists and socialists widely assimilated evolution into their own theories, Italian liberal economists confronted the concept in several unnamed articles in the Giornale degli Economisti in 1891 that claimed evolution was outright false. In fact, the author attacked the premise of economics as a discipline, especially if the only difference between a cockroach and Michelangelo was a graduated scale of intelligence. The mysterious author argued if evolution was correct, economics would merely be natural history. The problem was the historical link in the process. There was a hiatus between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom. Those missing links of evolution, those hiatuses, were evident in differences of intelligence, conscious purpose, and music, the author claimed. For them, the true force of humankind was merely mean-spirited, individualist egoism, and nothing more. At the same time, however, evolutionary theory faced severe criticism in Italy, and not only by sociologists and economists. Already in the late 1890s, Vilfredo Pareto himself rejected that a universal process of natural selection completely accounted for social behavior. Still, he envisaged tracing the uniformities of evolutionary change to ultimately predict the future from the past. The socialist philosopher Antonio Labriola agreed with Pareto's rejection of evolution's universality, and he warned against making analogies between human and non-human animals out of the dramatic hiatus between them. Above all, Labriola rejected the imperative and fate that Darwinists made from survival of the fittest. It was such dramatic levels of theory that Labriola claimed reduced the infinite processes of reality into one fantastic evolution, Curiously, the unnamed author in the Giornale had also thought there were different particular evolutions that debunked the Spencerian model, which was nothing other than what he thought was the boundless exaggeration of a true, but not unlimited, principle. By 1898, Luigi Einaudi, who would even later become the president of Italy, mocked that there was a new theory on the origins and evolution of society every month. The young Benedetto Croce, much like his friend and mentor Labriola, meanwhile condemned evolution as an empty and indeterminate generality that, even if it only meant reality evolves, that is to say reality changes, was still a transcendent and irresistible force that negated the historical contingent nature of change in the first place. Indeed, Croce's uncle, the early Neapolitan Hegelian Bertrando Spaventa, had similarly rejected a singular evolution a decade earlier. One evolution necessitated a previous evolution, and then another, ad infinitum, until one arrived at an indeterminate first base, that is, Hegel's pure being. Another idealist theorist, Giovanni Gentile, meanwhile scoffed at socialists like Ferri who attempted to integrate natural selection into their theories. For if socialist communalism could truly triumph over that natural law, it wasn't a rigid law at all. Indeed, Gentile was scathing in his critiques of evolution. He charged Darwin with the spread of realist and positivist thought in Europe, which he regarded as the negation of all philosophy.
The introduction of Karl Marx's historical materialism would soon base radical implications upon the past. As Marx himself had written, the real driving force of history was not merely apparitions of the mind, of purely intellectual concepts, it was the practical overthrow of the actual social relations which gave rise to the idealistic humbug. According to Marx, this very process was revolution itself. Indeed, he professed to have discovered the real ground of history in the sum of productive forces of a given historical and cultural context. Yet, Marx was notoriously vague over the imminence of a revolution, and the question was largely left to loom over European and Italian thought as a specter for decades. Already by the early 1890s, Achille Lauro advanced the theory that the natural development of society would result inevitably in the collapse of capitalism and socialist revolution. Indeed, Enrico Ferri thought the same and credited Lauro for completing his scientific education in socialism. Even a decade later, in 1906, the Italian syndicalist pioneer Arturo Labriola outright thought that revolution was the very imperative of economic necessity. However, Arturo mocked Lauro and Ferri's passive trust in the organic development of things, as though socialism would arrive by an automatic and irresistible force. He thought the notion was historical fatalism and an imaginary goddess that merely served to mystically qualify the logic of a social system. As Arturo explained, the agents of our destiny are ourselves, and not external, deterministic forces of history. Indeed, Benito Mussolini wrote in the early 1900s that the revolution is merely the critical moment of evolution that arrived not by passive quietism, but by a bloody duel between the forces of conversation and those of becoming. It would be this insurrectional storm, Mussolini thought, that would lead to the advent of socialism. Italian theorists were thus confronted with questions of philosophies of history, of concepts that could make scientific, accurate predictions of the future from historical inquiry. Antonio Labriola had famously qualified the notion in essays where he claimed Marx had merely provided a morphological prevision but not a definite prophecy or a promise. Benedetto Croce accepted this explanation in one of his first entries of philosophical thought and characterized historical materialism as a simple philosophizing about history. It wasn't until the 1890s, as Croce attempted to initiate a national history of Italy at a career turning point, when he claimed to have found himself brought unconsciously to the problem of the nature of history and of knowledge, Then, in 1895, after Antonio Labriola himself sent him the first chapter of his essays on the Communist Manifesto, Croce felt his whole mind burst into flame as he becomes powerless but to halt his historical studies and dive with inexpressible fervor into economics. In an article in 1896, Croce accepted Labriola's qualification and himself toned down the certainty of Marxian concepts. Croce rejected teleologies and a priori historical schemes. He interpreted historical materialism as a mere canon or hermeneutic lens, and he framed any historical laws as truisms and tendencies. Above all, Croce rejected philosophies of history for their reduction of all facts into a single fact. The philosopher Giovanni Gentile, meanwhile, read Labriola and Croce's work and began a decades-long correspondence with Croce in the summer of 1896. For Gentile, the question of whether Marx's historical materialism was a philosophy of history had not been satisfactorily resolved. He wrote to Croce, a morphological provision still referred to a future process, traceable between known points in space and time. With any level of future prediction at all, then, Gentile thought, the concept was, in fact, a philosophy of history. In Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy, he wrote that philosophy reflected the very fruit of the labor of millennia. This philosophy is a result of all that has gone before. He continued, there is a development in it too, but one that is occurring in the present day. There, Hegel would make a provocative conclusion, history of philosophy in the same as the system of philosophy. Bertrando Spaventa himself had conceived philosophy as a product of all the previous moments of the spirit. The Italian Hegelian Augusto Vera, who translated much of Hegel's most popular work into French, including the gigantic 2-volume Science of Logic, similarly thought that history was a living manifestation and the highest and truest expression of reason. Indeed, Hegelian historicism was the subject of one of Antonio Labriola's earliest critics of his professors at the University of Naples in 1869, where he rejected the equation of philosophy and its history as the dogma of the century. To be sure, it was only that same decade when a small few Hegelians in Naples and southern Italy earned stable employment as professors and government employees. In the years leading up to Italian unification, Hegelian notions were largely confined outside of official instruction in private schools, even if the first cohort were enthusiastic to study and interpret Hegelian theory into their own anti-urban politics. As Spaventa recounted the moment the Hegelian idea penetrated the mind of the young cultivators of science, who uniting fraternally took to advocating in speech and in writing as if moved by saintly love. By the end of the century, however, after most of the Neapolitan Hegelians had passed away, the theoretical movement in Italy virtually perished. Hegelian ideas, however, were about to enjoy an idealist rebirth by a few Italian philosophers in the late 1890s. Giovanni Gentile formed a passionate attachment to Spaventa's work and wrote to Croce that he committed himself to studying methodologically and diligently all of Spaventa's thoughts in 1898. As Gentile explained to Croce, Spaventa had attempted to shape the Italian mind by forming a philosophical conscience as a development of our history. However, Gentile explained, after the Risorgimento and the great Italian Hegelians died out, philosophy declined in Italy and the flame died out. Interestingly, Gentile's thesis for graduation at Pisa in 1897 repeated Hegel's historicist thesis. Consciousness is itself a formation and therefore historical life in which each degree summarizes all the previous ones, or it is completely inconceivable. Therefore, philosophy and the history of philosophy are one and the same thing. Soon after, Gentile pioneered an extensive republishing effort of Spaventa's works. since he thought the spiritual situation of Italian culture in Spaventa's time cannot be said to be substantially different from the present. If Gentile appropriated the pure historicist thesis of Hegel's lectures, Benedetto Croce would draw from the science of logic. To be sure, Hegel's logic was not an encyclopedia of syllogisms, but a pure science, according to Hegel, of the very logic of nature, of consciousness. As Augusto Vera explained, Hegel's logic was a science of the absolute forms of thought and existence, which mark all things with an imprint. Indeed, it was in Croce's own logic as science of the pure concept that he carried over the recent debates over evolution and Marx into a novel concept of history. In Hegelian terms, Croce wrote that the various aspects of spirit were not completely exhausted by prototypical philosophy of history models. According to Croce, these theories merely re-articulated the problem of historical change rather than addressing the logical basis of that fact. Such theories were not the explanation of facts, but is the fact itself. Indeed, reminiscent of Kant's critical philosophy, Croce explained that perception itself was a complicated fact, with its own historical existence. It was its historicity, in fact, that enabled conscious life at all. History renders existence all the manifestations of reality, qualifying them in their varying nature. Croce's logic, then, was the identification of historical change itself as an essential category of conscious experience. Outside of that logic, according to Croce, reality was wholly distinct and in constant flux. The uniformities of Pareto were merely arbitrary abstractions as pseudo-concepts. Indeed, it is apparent how Hegel related to Italian theorists' intellectual backdrop here. If Croce rejected the static, conceptual classifications of evolution in Marx, his response to view radical historical contingencies as logic itself isn't surprising. As Croce said, not a leaf moves that does not give rise to a historical fact, nor was any individual negligible in that development. History is everything that happens.